The early morning light filtered through the dense forest near Bethlehem, casting golden rays upon the dew-kissed grass. Young David crouched low, his sling clutched tightly in his hand, his sharp eyes fixed on the massive paw prints embedded in the soil. The silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant bleat of terrified sheep. A bear had stolen one of his father's lambs, and David was determined to bring it back. His heart thudded, not with fear, but with the thrill of the hunt. He spotted movement, a hulking shadow lumbering ahead. The bear, with its ferocious snarl, cradled the lamb in its massive jaws. David whispered a prayer, a quiet plea to the Eternal for strength. With practiced precision, he loaded his sling. The stone whizzed through the air, striking the bear between the eyes. It let out a furious roar, dropping the lamb. David leaped forward with his staff, and with one final strike, the beast collapsed, its growl fading into silence. Breathing heavily, David scooped up the trembling lamb, cradling it in his arms.
"You are safe now, little one,"
he murmured, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. As David emerged from the woods, his elder brother Eliab stood waiting by the pasture. His arms were crossed, his face a thundercloud of frustration.
"David!"
Eliab bellowed, marching toward him.
"Where have you been? You were supposed to guard the flock, not abandon it for some wild chase."
"I couldn't let the bear take one of our lambs."
David protested, holding up the rescued sheep as evidence of his triumph. Eliab snorted, shaking his head.
"Always the hero, aren't you? Do you think Father cares about your adventures? No, he cares about obedience. Leave the bravado and do your job."
David opened his mouth to retort, but stopped when Eliab raised a hand.
"Father wants you back at the house, now."
David approached the family home, his pulse quickening. He was greeted by his mother, Nitzevet, who took him aside. Nitzevet beckons Eliab to go on.
"Go ahead, Eliab. Let me speak to David for a moment."
Eliab proceeded to the main room. Nitzevet explains to David the urgency of the occasion and says to him,
"My beloved son, the prophet Samuel, is here to anoint the next king of Israel. All your brothers stood before him, but were sadly rejected. So I need you to be brave and let the Eternal One decide for you."
David smiled at his mother with solemn anticipation and proceeded to the main room. As he entered, the air was heavy with tension. Along the wall of the main room, his other brothers stood in a line, their faces etched with disappointment. Jesse, their father, looked uneasy, glancing between the prophet Samuel and his sons. Samuel, the revered prophet of Israel, stood up, his piercing gaze sweeping the room. He had come to anoint one of Jesse's sons as Israel's next king. Yet one by one, the Eternal had rejected each of the older brothers. When Samuel's eyes fell upon David, he hesitated, as though he couldn't believe what he saw. The boy's ruddy complexion, wild hair, and simple shepherd's attire seemed out of place among the solemn gathering. But then, the Eternal's voice thundered in Samuel's heart.
"Arise, anoint him, for this is the one."
Samuel's stern face softened. He took the horn of oil and stepped toward David, who stood frozen in disbelief. The prophet poured the oil over the boy's head, the rich liquid dripping down his golden mane. David's brothers exchanged incredulous looks, and Eliab muttered under his breath,
"Him? The runt?"
But David felt a warmth unlike anything he had ever known. It wasn't the oil, it was the presence of the Eternal, wrapping him in a sense of purpose. For the first time, he saw beyond his fields and flock. A destiny greater than himself awaited. Elsewhere at King Saul's palace, where shadows flickered across the walls of the throne room. Saul, once a mighty king, now slumped in his chair, his face pale and twisted with anguish. His attendants whispered nervously, casting glances at the monarch who was tormented by an evil spirit.
"The throne is mine."
Saul groaned, clutching his head.
"No one should take it from me, no one."
Saul was tormented by the images and the voices of his disobedience to the Eternal's command, playing in his mind over and over again.
"Go and utterly destroy the Amalekites and all they possess. Leave nothing alive. But why, Saul? You have disobeyed me."
Saul fell to his knees and cried out,
"I have obeyed, my lord. This kingdom belongs to me."
Saul snarled in agony.
Oh, my king. Let us find someone who plays the harp.
One of the servants proposed cautiously.
Music surely will soothe your troubled spirit.
Saul waved his hand dismissively at first, but another servant stepped forward.
There is a shepherd from Bethlehem, a son of Jesse. He plays beautifully and carries himself with courage and wisdom. The Eternal is surely with him.
Word reached Jesse's house, and David was summoned to the palace. He arrived with his harp in hand, nervous but eager. The palace was grand, a stark contrast to the humble fields of Bethlehem. David was ushered into the throne room, where Saul sat, his eyes wild with torment. David bowed low, then began to play. The haunting melody of his harp filled the room, weaving a spell of peace. Slowly, Saul's breathing steadied, and the tension in his face melted away. When David finished, Saul looked at him with something akin to gratitude.
What is your name, boy?
The king asked, his voice hoarse but calm.
I am David, son of Jesse.
The shepherd replied. Saul nodded.
Stay. Be my armor-bearer and musician. Your presence brings me rest.
In the quiet of his chambers that night, David marveled at how his life had shifted so suddenly. From chasing bears in the forest to calming a tormented king, he felt the weight of his calling. Yet in his heart, he remained the shepherd boy, trusting the Eternal One to guide him through whatever lay ahead. The cold desert ground trembles beneath the thunderous march of countless soldiers, their synchronized footsteps echoing like a drumbeat of doom. A chilling wind sweeps through the ranks of the Philistine army, their banners rippling violently against the darkening sky. From their midst, a lone figure emerges, a towering, monstrous warrior with the menacing bulk of a wild boar and the eyes of a merciless predator, Goliath. His shadow stretches long over the sand, swallowing the light. He grits his teeth, his voice a low, guttural growl that carries above the din.
I will crush them all, every last one, until their names are wiped from the earth, and their memory is dust.